Hello and welcome to Screen Theory. In this video, I want to help train your ear so that when you listen to somebody scream, you'll be able to make an educated guess as to what techniques they might be using to achieve a given sound. This is important because if you really admire a person's vocal style and you want to achieve a similar style to them, well, knowing what technique they are using to achieve that sound is a good place to start. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different examples of me screaming to various artists, and you are going to try to guess what techniques I'm using. The answers will be in the description as well as some notes with my analysis, so get through all the examples and then check your answers, and if you get something wrong, read my notes, go back and listen to it, and then hopefully you'll be able to understand why one example is one technique versus what you thought it might have been. There are 4 answer choices for you to choose from. That will be fry screaming, false chord screaming, hybrid screams, which is performing fry and false chord screams simultaneously, and then arytenoid cartilage-based distortion. Here are some guidelines you can use to help educate your guess. These will apply to almost every vocalist, but there's definitely going to be some instances where these might not hold up so well. And that has to do with the unique properties of a person's voice, how they might be performing the technique if they found a really unique or obscure way to do it, and if you're listening to a professionally mixed and mastered track, well, what effects might be applied on the vocal tracks can influence what you're hearing, but generally these should work for most situations. So, fry screams tend to sound very staticky, raspy, thin, and sometimes screechy. A common pattern of pronunciation that most fry screaming vocalists use is a very quick, rapid, and harsh transition from syllable to syllable and word to word. The distortion that the false chords produce can sound very rough, crisp, and sometimes hollow, where you'll hear like this serrated cutting sound of the distortion as the false chords vibrate and flap around. A common pattern of pronunciation that many false chord vocalists tend to fall into is a more fluid and flowy transition from syllable to syllable and word to word, where it just kind of sounds like they're dragging their false chords through each syllable. With hybrid screams, you should be able to hear elements of both techniques, although it's not always a perfect ratio of like 50% false chord distortion and 50% fry screaming distortion. Sometimes it's a little more subtle than that. Like, for instance, a person might be primarily fry screaming, but you can still hear very subtle vibrations of their false chords, just adding a little bit of roughness or like crackles to their scream. Or a person might be primarily false chord screaming and then slightly dipping into fry screaming distortion here and there. It just depends. Those instances will require a much better trained ear to be able to pick out those subtle elements and details if they're slightly dipping into one technique over the other, but I will try to make these examples pretty obvious so that if you just listen closely and you follow these guidelines, you should be able to get the right answer. And the distortion that the arytenoid cartilages produce is a very deep, usually very low-pitched, gurgly, or sometimes smoother-sounding distortion. If the arytenoid cartilage are vibrating kind of slowly, it's going to sound very gurgly. If we find an optimal way for them to vibrate, where they can vibrate very, very quickly without any impedance, then it sounds very smooth. But the distinct sounds that I think of with the arytenoid cartilage is it sounds very massy and dense. It sounds like earth is moving, or like someone is scraping a cinder block against pavement. As far as I'm aware, the arytenoid cartilage can really only be used to produce very deep, low-pitched, guttural, growly sounds. And that has to do with, 1, the shape of the arytenoid cartilage, and 2, the position we need in order to bring the arytenoid cartilage together so that they will rumble as we pass air through them is a very similar positioning to a very deep, low-pitched screaming positioning where we really shove the tongue back and drop the larynx to get a better contraction of our adductor muscles in our larynx, which then brings the arytenoid cartilage together so that they can rumble and vibrate as we pass air through them. So I know that's a lot, but just try to keep this in mind. Fry screaming, thin and screechy. False chord screaming, rough and crispy. Hybrid screaming, you'll hear elements of both. And arytenoid cartilage-based distortion sounds very deep and massy, and it sounds like an earthquake. The last piece of advice I have is try to listen past the unique elements of my voice and just try to focus on the actual sound of the distortion that is being produced by each technique. So now put on a good pair of headphones or listen with a good pair of speakers. Here we go.
Into my funny breath escapes, gazing upon this world, into it hides. So who's to say we can die in our dreams? Sometimes black, but always so bitter and bleak. Just like the sun, but the mind I see is what it wants to say. River of blood and poison tongue, it's all that's left of me. Let them promise you the world, but don't you take it. 'Cause when you give them what they ask, they turn their backs. It's a sham, a sham, a sham. It's all a fucking sham. Turn away and run from this as fast as you can. I swear we need to find some comfort in this rain down place. To bridge the gap in this conscious state that we live in. Let I'm short on time. One holy inversion of hope, twisting the faith of the meek into weeds. Driven insane by the dark one, to bring forth the foul planning he speaks. The underground among us, dawn they shrink back to their sunken pits. They dance by night and drink the blood of a child's broken neck. Within this crystal lies the power revealed. Go forth, you child of chaos, for these veins are your will. Consume their fluid till you've had your fill. For the temptress sides her eyes, and she now bends her will. Facing you, your words like a gun, one shot when you speak. So pull the trigger, aim it at me. I'm stuck in the middle of a crossfire. Breaking me down is what you desire. I won't let you. These masquerading as predators, masquerading as the rich, deconstructing revelations with a stunning in the face of revelations. It's contagious, fuck, take a look. Murder drips from the neck of every man, woman, and child. Story drips out. Where is the decency? Don't exist. This isn't over, baby, don't believe a word they say. But then, she takes a moment to pour to what I could have been given another chance. To find the light in the darkness and a way out of this, if only she can see what I can see. Deep inside, the madness decides you hurt. This foretelling of creepers, your doom is feral. The dissolution of the human and the god disgrace, obliteration precedes the fatal function disease. Devastation's the antidote to the anthem of greater law. Dishonoring fathers to shedding the blood. Environ the influence rising through all. From the abyss of bitter loneliness to the nostalgic rush of memory. If only I possessed the flame in which I was born. A living body so I can embrace and rejoice. Your day, vocal, image, sleepeth. Purple flame now, lift all of them, constricting their limbs as they're bound to a cross. May these false prophets return to sons of men. Miles of mindless minions march to munch upon your marrow, inclined to make you one of the infected. These fiends will be no more. These vicious bombs you wield will send them to the morgue. Creation's emanating between the shifting sands. The universe is turning in the palm of my hand. I will make the earth and clay, exhuming breath of life, be all the culmination of my regrets. But I saw it die. But I watched it die. We saw it die. Grieving within the shadows, they seek out lost seas. Deep in their nightmares, embedded in their bones. They drag them through the dirt, the gladiators in the skin. They grasp them by the hair, and tear them to the king. Like fingerprints on your heart, reading out the last lines of code. To the untrained eye, your secret. I bled away the last of you, so twisted shapes of combined resolve. The chicken from a last and solid case, fought off attacks of resurface lost. Burn the grazing ground. Punish the non-believers, convict them with lie after lie, commits this genocide that a saber leader, brainwashing the whole populace. In the name of God we trust.
Alright, so I really did my best to try to exaggerate the elements of each technique that I hope you will have picked up on, and if you got any of those wrong, then just read my notes in the description, go back and listen, and see if you can then understand why a certain technique that I performed is what it is if you got it wrong. Ultimately, the best way to train your ear is to spend a long time practicing each technique, where you're taking it in every different direction you can find. If you are practicing false chord screaming and you hear somebody else who you are fairly certain is false chord screaming, but they just have this unique element to their style, spend a few weeks practicing to them. See if you can achieve that unique sound. And at the end of the day, every time you go through this process, it will teach you something new about each technique. It's like that quote from, I think, The Force Awakens. You live long enough, you see the same eyes in different people. Well, when you practice metal vocals for long enough, you tend to notice the same patterns in different people who are using the same technique. But hopefully this helped you, especially if you're a beginner and you're having a hard time understanding the difference between how all these different techniques sound and some of the different things you'll be able to do with them. Well, hopefully this puts you in the right direction, so now you can apply this to all the different vocalists that you'll listen to. Sometimes it's really obvious to tell what technique a person is using, other times it's not so obvious, but as we continue to train our ear, it will get easier. So if you like this video and you like the way I teach metal vocals, well, please give a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all in the next one.